hearing the voice of God and saying, "Here, my Lord, send me." The last general conference in Missouri was a catastrophe for the entire denomination. It is a poor witness of who we are as United Methodists. I left that conference devastated. Going back home, I heard a voice saying to me, "John, you got to do something." Praise be to God, over my many years as missionary and now as bishop of the church, I have got to know so many good friends across the sexual spectrum. And so it was easy for me to contact them and share my views with them to say, this is what God is calling us to do.
So here's what he did. He put together a group of people. He called together a group of Central Conference bishops, and he got us together in July of this year in Chicago. He initially included, the fourth bullet down, he initially included 5 progressive persons from organizations related to progressive people that are coalition groups. He then called 5 centrist people that are connected to coalition groups that are centrist. Then he called 5 traditional people that were connected to those groups. And he got those 15 people together, and they got the Central Conference bishops together, and he put us in a room together, and he said, "I think we should be able to work out something together." That was not an easy meeting. I mean, that was like, because the General Conference was still kind of fresh. It happened about 5 months earlier, and we were thinking about it. But by the end of that meeting, we decided that we would be very wise to meet again. But that if we were going to ever make any progress, we probably needed a mediator. And so what the group did is, each of the 5, we also agreed the group had to be smaller, because doing this type of work is very hard with a large group. Commission on the Way Forward had 32 people because it was based on representation. Methodists, one of our values is representation. We want all sorts of people in the room. And so that's how it was done. But because it had 32 people, it took 2 years to do its work. Because the larger the group, the harder it is to figure things out. And so this group had a different strategy. They said this isn't going to be about representation. It's going to be about figuring out, it's going to be about ideological spectrum. Now that's very different. A lot of United Methodists have complained about that. They said it's not representative. You didn't include young people. You didn't include this. You didn't include that. And Bishop Yambasu wasn't working on that axis. And so the 5 people in each group physically huddled up. I mean, we stood in a circle and looked at each other. And the centrists got together. I can only speak to that group. And they're like, all right, who's going to do it? We need 2 people. Who's going to do it? And eventually, one of the fingers pointed at me, and it was like, Mike will lead anything. He'll let him do it, And then Junius Dotson, who's the chairperson of the general secretary of the Board of Discipleship, they're the people that put a lot of our materials together to help you grow deeper in your faith. That's what he does for a living, and so he came. He understands that piece of the church really well. I had a lot of content knowledge from the Commission on the Way Forward. I think that's one of the reasons I was chosen. And this group had no budget. Any flight you've got to take, you pay for it. Any meeting you go to. In fact, they can't even afford the meeting rooms. Like that meeting room in Chicago, we had to take up a little collection to pay for that. And your food, it's on you. Everything's on you. So here's the good news for the Methodist. It's not representative, but it didn't cost you anything. I mean, I hate to say it. It's all volunteer. And I know that doesn't make up for the lack of representation, but this was being done on a very different axis for very different reasons. And this group has no authority. This group can't dictate anything. It can call the church to things, but it can't tell the church what it's going to do. Yeah. And so here's who ended up being on the group. And eventually we ended up with 3 attorneys. Ken Feinberg is the 4th person from the left. I'll tell you about him in a moment. Wendy Bloom is the 2nd person for the left. You know what those 2 attorneys have in common? Other than giving all of their time for free? They're both Jewish. To have Jewish mediators for United Methodist is awesome. Because they've got no stake in the game, right? Like they're just doing this as a mikvah. They're just doing this out of the goodness of their heart. There is a United Methodist attorney on the back right, Rick Godfrey. Rick Godfrey is the conference chancellor in Northern Illinois and in the Chicago area. Rick Godfrey and Wendy Bloom work with Ken Feinberg on the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. That's the connection. So when Rick Godfrey heard that we were looking for a mediator, and we had all submitted names of mediators we know, and with all due respect to the list of names that we had put together, so then somebody dropped Ken Feinberg, and we were like, that's probably better. And if you know that name, Ken Feinberg has done all these famous mediations in the past 20 years. So when 9/11 happened and the Twin Towers fell and all those people were hurt and died, there was a giant fund, and Ken Feinberg was responsible for deciding how much each survivor would receive or family members would receive. He's an amazing guy. The BP oil spill, that was like $4 billion worth of payout. He did TARP, which is, you remember Too Big Not to Fail, Boeing, GM, Volkswagen. He did the Hokie Spirit Fund here in Virginia for free. That's what pro bono means. It means free. And he did everything he did for us. When we met with him the very first time, I was with a small group of people that met with him for the first time. And at the end of it, he heard our story, he heard about everything. And at the end of it, he just put his hand up and he said, okay, I've already done my research on you all. He said, thank you for sharing your perspectives, but I've decided I'm going to do this. He said, you're 12 million people, about 6 million in the United States, about 6 million abroad, most of those in Africa. And he said, and we're in a time of rampant anti-institutionalism, and you do good all over the world, and you matter. And because you matter, I'm going to do it for free. And if I have to travel anywhere to do any meetings after this is done, it's on my dime and at my expense. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? Remarkable man who lives out his faith in these ways. 6 sessions. That's kind of amazing. I'll tell you one thing, when Ken Feinberg says, I'll give you 6 sessions, you get pretty serious about how you use the time. And he didn't tell us he was going to give us 6. He told us originally, I'll give you 2. But he gave us 6 because he's working with Methodist.
With great credibility. When you get a group like this together that can deliver, that has the authority and credibility to try and reach an agreement, you become optimistic fairly quickly. Everybody of the 16 members and the mediator, everybody recognized that if you do not reach an agreement, unanimous, ask yourself this question: what is the alternative to decades of strife, tension, stress? And it quickly became apparent to me as the mediator that the right group was in the room with the competence, the creativity, the flexibility to find a way to reach a unanimous agreement. I also had 2 other secret weapons which helped tremendously. Richard Godfrey and Wendy Bloom of the distinguished national law firm of Kirkland & Ellis in Chicago participated in every single mediation session. They provided the venue, the logistical resources. They occasionally shut off the heat and air conditioning if we weren't getting the yes. They did a fabulous job in keeping everybody's eye on the ball. And for their input, this mediator and this group are extremely grateful.
So we met down in Washington, D.C. at Kirkland & Ellis, as he just said, in a really amazing conference room area of that firm, and all that was given to the United Methodist Church for free. It was just sort of remarkable. What Mr. Feinberg does very well is he moves you from being at war to entering into a space of peace. He moves you from saying, this is what I need, this is what I want, to looking at all the parties involved and having all the parties look at each other saying, what do you need to get to the future you want? What do you need to get to the future you want? And as somebody who did the work on the Commission The Way Forward, as somebody who went to the General Conference, and as somebody who's been really connected to all this, it was a very different experience. And he moved us into the space of Jesus saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers." I can't tell you what a remarkable experience it was as a spiritual experience. And I can't say that I spent every moment of all that mediation time in that space. But he is a very relentless, persistent human being, because what he does really well is what he just said. He just keeps coming back and saying, and he'd say, "So anyway, let me get this straight. We're down now. We're down to 4 items. And you're saying that this thing is so important to you. Let me get this straight. This is so important to you that you'd rather have that than have an agreement. You're willing to go to the 2020 General Conference and go to war to hope to get the thing you want. Is that what you're saying?" And then whoever said it was, and we all said it at different times, we're all like, "Well, not exactly, say more." He has just a remarkable capacity to remind you of what's going to happen if you don't do what he's inviting you to do and the risk you're taking. And eventually it moved us into better relationships and a better conversation.
That he offered during this process were that our job was to get to yes, and he kept reminding us of that. He also reminded us that we had the opportunity to write the narrative, and that if we didn't write it, someone else would. And that we being United Methodists, not necessarily the 16 people at the table.
That's Shan Lawrence, who's the Executive Director of Reconciling Ministries Network that works for full inclusion of LGBTQ persons in churches and in the denomination as well. And she's exactly right. One of the things that Ken Feinberg said is, if you all do another conference like 2019, you're going to lose all credibility in the country. Who's going to want to go to your church? But he said, you got an opportunity here. He said, if you do this right, if you can all come to agreement, if you can all get to yes, and if you can convince the General Conference to get to yes, you're different from everybody. You're different from the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans. You're different. Why? Because you didn't do this in court. You didn't do this through lawsuits and churches taking their property and all that conflict. And so here's what the protocol said when we finally finished it and signed it. I'm going to walk through an overview of this. It's going to take about 28 minutes, and then we're going to have time for about 30 minutes of Q&A if you want to stay that long. Floris members, I originally was going to talk about our 3 work streams. I'm probably not going to do that tonight because it's going to take too long. And I'll get to that in probably in a month. I'll probably come back and do another one of these in a month and let you know how things are going. So just so you know, that's where we're headed. Here's the deal. If you sign the protocol, and if you go read the protocol, it's online, it's on umc.org, or United Methodist News Service, probably, it's on the Virginia Conference page somewhere. But read the protocol. It's about 6 to 7 pages, and the last page and a half are signature pages. But notice the groups that are behind the signatures. Because if you could get all those groups to agree, then maybe you'd have something, because those are the groups that were really warring with each other at the last General Conference. And so what the groups have agreed is, the traditionalists have already submitted their plans for General Conference. They have one that's called the Indianapolis Plan. They have another one that's called the Traditional Plan that makes what we have now more so. Centrists have a plan called the Next Generation UMC Plan. And there's some other legislation there. Progressives have their own plans that have gone through. So all these groups have these plans. So what all the groups mentioned on the signature page have done is they've all said, I will not support the plan I wrote. I'll just support the legislation in this protocol. So, for instance, I was invited to go to, there's a conference in Nashville this week for General Conference delegates, and I was invited to come and present the UMC, Next Generation UMC Plan, which is an inclusive plan that I helped write, and I said, I can't do it. And the guy that asked me said, what do you mean you can't do it? I said, I signed this protocol. I can't support that plan anymore. Well, you wouldn't be supporting it, you'd just be presenting it. And I said, yeah, I think that might confuse people a little bit. I said, I think that breaks both the spirit and the letter of the law. So I don't think that's what we want to do. And I said, here's some people that can do that if you need it. But the thing is, the groups won't support those. Well, if those plans can receive so little energy that they essentially die, it focuses the General Conference and the legislation that comes out of this protocol. That's the desire, and it's yet to be seen if the people that were in that protocol meeting can deliver that. Because if people don't like the legislation that comes out of this protocol, they're going to lift that, they're going to give those plans energy themselves. And they have every right to, because the General Conference delegates can act on all the legislation that's before them. You can't take that right away from them. So this group is a volunteer group, and it's offering an opportunity. The second thing is, this is not, see, when the Commission on the Way Forward was put together, they said, give us as much unity as possible. That's not what this group did. This group from the very beginning said there's going to be separation. You know, before I started on the Commission on the Way Forward, I met with the assistant to the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Sean, what is his name? David? Yes. And he and I had lunch, and he said, here's what you're going to discover by the end of this. You must either walk together loosely or part with a blessing. There are no other options. But the Commission on the Way Forward said, no, we're going to choose as much unity as possible. That feels a little bit like walk together loosely. That's what we tried. But it didn't work. People said they didn't want that. This assumes separation. And that's been hard for a lot of people, but having been through a lot of this, I just don't know what else can be done. The mediation team will develop legislation to offer the 2020 General Conference, and that's happening right now. And those of you who are Floris members, I'm a part of that group that's putting that legislation together. There are 2 people that are traditionalists. There are actually 3 people that are centrists, and there are 2 people that are would identify as progressives. And the centrists have 3 because I said I'll do it, but only if an attorney in my church gets to help. The group will use its best efforts to encourage all parties and groups to vote for the protocol, and those who choose to separate agree they will bring no future claims, financial claims, against the United Methodist Church. We want it done, and we want it done and done. No annual conference. Here's the good news. If you decide you want to be a United Methodist in the future, you don't have to vote on anything. The number one piece of feedback that I heard as a Commission on the Way Forward, the whole commission heard, is when I was on the commission, is that people said, don't make me vote. Don't make my church vote. Don't make my annual conference vote. Don't make us vote. Why? We're all doing fine in our big tent, but if you make us vote, we're going to have to divide the tent up, and it's going to be painful. Don't make us vote. So you know what? No vote. So here's the deal. You only have to vote if your annual conference says it's going to leave and you want to stay United Methodist. If your annual conference says we're going to leave and you want to leave with them, you don't have to vote. So it's based on the thought that we want to vote as few times as possible. If you're a United Methodist, and unless your annual conference votes to separate, you remain a United Methodist by simply doing nothing. And if there's one thing United Methodists are excellent at, oh, that's bad. Okay, Carrie will edit that too. That'll come in. If your annual conference does vote to separate, though, if your annual conference does vote to separate, and you want to remain a United Methodist, then you can vote to stay in the denomination. What are we imagining in that denomination? Every conversation I've had about that denomination envisions a denomination that will have the capacity for clergy to perform same-sex marriages and to be ordained if they're openly gay. That's what everybody's imagining. They're also imagining that everyone can but no one must perform a same-sex marriage. So there are traditional people who want to stay in the denomination, and all they want to know is, can I honor the convictions I have? And frankly, when I talk to a lot of these folks, they're on a journey. They're on a journey. And what they want to know is, can I take that journey with you, or do I have to go and live in this traditional space? Because the protocol envisions a traditional denomination, and it envisions the possibility that there may be a very progressive denomination. What does that mean? That would mean everyone must. Everyone can, no one must. No one can. Does that distinction make sense? So this is sort of what we're envisioning in this broad center space, but I can't tell you that's going to happen. The General Conference will have to make that happen. But that's what's envisioned with people in this room. The protocol would allow new denominations to be created that United Methodist annual conferences and churches could move to. It envisions that happening. They can begin registering May 15th of this year. They can register their intent beginning after General Conference if this is passed, but they have to do it by May 15th, 21. Sorry. Central conferences may join a new denomination by December 31st of 21. We're going to give them 6 more months. And the reason is the timing of their annual conferences is different from the timing of ours. All annual conferences can vote to join this new denomination. Now, how would that happen? How would an annual conference say, I want to leave the denomination with all of my property, because here's what part of this, you're going to see this in a moment. We're going to relax the trust clause if this legislation is passed. So, and you may not know this. This beautiful building, many of us have a lot of skin in the game on this one, amen? And oddly, we don't own it. Our trustees hold it in trust for the United Methodist Church. And so they're on record at the courthouse, that's the deal. Which means if we say we're going to do something different from the denomination, and we don't want to be a United Methodist anymore, we can't keep this. That's what the Episcopalians, Presbyterians, others have been dealing with. So this would relax that trust clause. It would allow an annual conference or a local church to move into a more traditional denomination or a more progressive denomination, and you could take all that property with you. And so how would that happen? Well, in an annual conference, what would happen is we have an annual conference session. Ours will be in June. Most in the U.S. will be in June. And let's just say that somebody stands up and says, I want us to go into a different denomination. Would somebody do that? Terry, would you do that? Terry, would you come up here? Yeah, do you mind? Would you mind doing that? Terry, just come up here. And here's Terry, and she comes to the microphone, and she just stands at the microphone. And now Terry says, I want us to vote to join a new denomination. Yeah, you gotta say it. It's more fun. Yeah, okay, now, there it is, right? Here's the deal. 20% of you, well, first it has to be seconded. Let's assume she gets second. You almost always do. Yeah, oh, look, somebody's seconding right there. Yeah, there's like 3 of you. Wow, you guys are anxious, yeah. So you're anxious, but you want to go to 2 different denominations. That's the problem. So she would say the denomination she thinks we should join. Maybe more progressive, maybe more traditional. But then 20% of us would have to say, I'm in. 1 in 5 of us would have to agree to that. Pretty low threshold, isn't it? But maybe we're in a conference where everybody's like, no, we don't want to vote on this. And everybody's like, and you know that Terry, right? She's always kicking up something. She's all, oh, there she goes again, right? I know you're not going to say it because you're Methodist, but you're going to think it. And so Terry's there, and so maybe Terry gets the 20% and maybe she doesn't. All right? But if she doesn't, she just takes her seat again. Now, if she gets her 20%, then the bishop would have to decide, when's that vote going to be taken? I think most bishops will say that vote will be taken within a certain time period. Because that's a big vote. That's a historic vote. So you probably don't want to do it when people are emotionally up here. You probably want people to have information. You want them to be thoughtful about what they're really doing. And so you don't want to take that vote right then. You probably want to wait a little bit. So I don't know how long that would be, but I'm sure the legislation will say something about that. And then they can do that. And when we come back and we take that vote, whether it's right then or later, 57% of us have to agree to Terry's motion. Isn't that a weird number? Aren't you thinking that? That's a weird number. Why is that a weird number? Because more conservative, traditional people, they wanted the number to be a simple majority, 50% plus 1. Why? Because they want to leave. If you want to leave, you want the threshold low. More centrist and progressive people said, wait a minute. We can envision this new United Methodist Church as a more inclusive space. And you know what? That's like changing the constitution of the church. That's like doing a big decision. And there's a whole list in the Book of Discipline of decisions that are made on a 2/3 majority because they're so significant. 2/3. 66%. What do you notice about 57? It's almost halfway between those 2 spaces. And Ken Feinberg in the press release, somebody asked him the question, like, how did you get to 57%? He said, oh, I'll tell you why. It was one of the hardest things we mediated, and finally I just used the mediator's prerogative, and I told him, it's this number. And honestly, when Ken Feinberg goes, and so it's going to be this number, here's what everybody's like, okay. I mean, after a while, you wonder, why am I making any decisions? Why am I even talking? Just let him do it all, because he's very wise. And what's wise about him is, he said, go out, because what we would do is the centrists would go into one room, and the progressives would go into another room, and the traditionalists would go to another room, and then we would call leaders in those groups that are listed after our names. We had this circle of people that we would call and convene and say, can you live with this? So it's not just the two of us doing it on our own. We're reaching out, they're reaching out. Because what Feinberg's saying is, look, you have to sell this to your people. And if you can't sell this to your people, if you can't get them to come along, don't bother. So 57 is really odd, but that's where it came from. Hey, I've got some more people that are in here that are going to speak, but I never know when they're going to pop up, so it's very exciting for me. So every time I go to press, I'm like, and here we go. Oh, good, no one's speaking. There it is. Local churches, let's say that your annual conference votes, let's say that you're in an annual conference somewhere and it says, I want to become more traditional. But your local church doesn't want to do that. Your local church wants to stay. Let's say that you're in a state, let's say you're in a state, and some states are like this, they're divided, they have 2 annual conferences, North and South. Let's say the one in the bottom said, I want to leave, but your church said, we want to stay. And we understand that we're in the minority vote on this thing, we get it, but we want to stay. Your church could then take a vote on staying. So we give you the ability to stay if you want to. Now, how would that vote be taken? Well, first your church council would decide simple majority or 2/3. Those are the 2 standards in the book of discipline. And the protocol gives your church the ability, your church council, that's your leadership group, to make that decision. But then when the vote is held, let's say they say simple majority, okay? That's what their decision is. When the vote is held, it's not the church council holding that votes, it's all the professing members of the church. So here at Floris, that's a couple thousand people potentially. They all get a vote. If they all show up, I don't know how we'll do this. That just ran through my head. I'm not sure. That's interesting. Well, there's another problem for another day. But that's what we would do. We'd come, and you would get a vote. We've got some of our students here on the frontier rows. Those of you who are confirmed, you get a vote. Isn't that great? Isn't it great to be a Methodist? See? That means you already have power. That means you already have a voice. Now, if you're not confirmed, well, foo on you. That's what we say. You gotta take care of your spiritual business. You gotta take care of your spiritual work. But that's another story for another day, as we say. Now, the vote will be taken at a church conference. Financial agreements. There are some financial agreements in here. Number 1, local churches joining a new Methodist denomination over here or over there. You get to keep all your assets. The trust clause gets relaxed. Nobody's got to go to court. There's no lawsuit. There's no animosity. You just get to do it for a limited time period. This is a limited time offer. The annual conference will not exercise its trust clause. And you are expected, during the separation period, you're expected to maintain your connectional responsibilities. What does that mean? What that means is you need to pay those apportionments while you're still in. This needs to be a good faith. We're inviting people to enter into the good spirit of the protocol. If you're at war, what you're saying is, I'm not paying. Well, no, because some of what you're paying are unfunded pension liabilities for the oldest clergy in our system. And shame on you if you're not paying those. Shame on you if you're expecting the rest of us to pay your share. That's not fair. Those pastors served your church. So you got to do these things. That's what adults do. Amen? There may be a time to withhold some apportionments. There may be a time to push back. But if this all happens, it's different. You retain all, annual conferences would retain all their property if they go to a new denomination on the left or on the right. They get the same deal. Traditional Methodists, if they form this new traditional space, $25 million. $25 million. Anybody know what the 4-year budget of our denomination is? Anybody? Really? Anybody? Our denomination has what's called a quadrennial budget. It's a 4-year budget. Over those 4 years, the budget is $604 million. Now, that's all the pension. There's a lot of things in there beyond ministry. Of course, pension is kind of a ministry, right? But there's a lot of money that's in that number, obviously. But the traditional Methodists, what we said is, if you all want to go, you have a historic connection to the wealth of the United Methodist Church. You helped build it. And so, you know what? We want you to start in a healthy way. So the way I think of this, this church, if you're from another congregation, this church has 2 sites. We have one in Loudoun County, and we have one in Reston, and then we have one online. But these 2 cost a lot of money. And so the way that we did that is about 60 or 80 of our people said, I'm going to go and I'm going to do the church in Reston. And then we took up a big offering, which we're still paying, and that money helped them. And then the one in Loudoun, same deal. And we support them for about 5 years while they get their footing. And then once they've got enough people, the expectation is you've got to support yourself. And so we see that as a real way to start new congregations and to make disciples of Jesus Christ. And so this $25 million helps this group start on its own. And some people have said it's too much, and other people said it's way too little, but I'm happiest that the traditional people in the room said it's fair. Right? It's fair is all I needed to hear. Maybe it's too much, maybe it's too little, long as it's fair. Now, on the other side, it just says other Methodist denominations, but when you really listen to the conversation, it's really about people that are more progressive, because there are some people in the United Methodist Church that call themselves liberationists. That's their label, and they're the most progressive among us, probably. And what they've said is maybe they want to do something, and we don't know if that group's going to get organized to do that or not. Nobody has any idea. But what the protocol group said is, you know what? If we're doing it over there, we got to do it over here. So $2 million is set aside for such a possibility. Why 2 here and 25 there? Because of the volume of people. This is a significantly larger group of people that will leave on this side than will on that side, so there's an indexing. Now, do we have exact numbers? No, we don't. But there's a provision that's made. That's the idea. If more than one traditional denomination, because now what the rumor is they're like, well, I'm not joining the WCA, that's the Wesley Covenant Association. Other groups say, maybe I'm going to do that. That's not ours to sort out. There's $25 million, and in the legislation, there will be a way to divide that up should there be more than one group.
Reverend Boyette, can you give a very
This is
brief
Keith Boyette.
summary of the
He's a traditional
proposal
person.
and say why this is the way to go?
Well, this was an amazing collaboration amongst a number of people who have serious disagreements around the fundamental issues, but share a deep love for the church and its mission. We recognized that we needed to find a way for the church to move forward, to provide a pathway for a hopeful future where we could walk committed to our convictions. A mediated negotiation requires that everybody not get exactly what they want, and that everyone has to contribute something, and the give and take ultimately finds a way forward. So the protocol creates a pathway for separation, for the creation of new Methodist denominations. It provides a means for central conferences, annual conferences, and local churches to determine how they're going to align with those Methodist denominations, and establishes voting thresholds at each level.
There's another financial consideration, and it's an earmark for $39 million over 2 quadrennia, which is 8 years. And that earmark is directed toward ministries for Asian, Black, Hispanic, Latino, Native American, Pacific Islander communities, and Africa University. We have a university, United Methodist Church, established in Old Mutare, Zimbabwe, that has become a major university in Africa that is providing leaders in health, theology, and business, and so many other majors. It's really a remarkable place. And this money is set aside for a couple of reasons that I want to tell you about. First, we already have what are called the national plans that are focused on these groups. So we know that happens already, so there's money in the budget for that already. And we already support African universities, so that happens already. But the fear is, when you start sending $25 million over here and you start sending $2 million over here, and then you also may lose part of the financial base of your church moving away so that you don't have the future income, the fear that we had is one of the first things that's going to be cut is money going to these groups. Because what people in different racial groups have observed about white people is they have a very bad habit of saying, you know what, we're going through this difficulty, but once we finish, we'll focus on you. And this prevents that bad behavior by earmarking the funds at the very beginning and saying, that's a missional investment. Like that right there, that looks a lot like what America is going to look like in the future and what it looks like right now. And if we don't make that missional investment, we can talk all we want about the problem we resolved. We've got to talk about the future we're embracing. And so the earmark makes that a priority. Now, it does acknowledge that there is a lot of historic injustice to groups that are listed right there from Americans, even though these people are Americans too. And we all know our racial history. It's Martin Luther King weekend, so you kind of got that, right? What this is not is the word reparation. That's not what this is. And I was asked about this in a couple of settings. Is that reparations? Friends, with all due respect, the United Methodist Church, I have looked with 5 financial experts that met with the 16 of us and opened up the books of the United Methodist Church and showed us what the values are in the property and the estimated values on the land and the buildings and all that. And it's a lot of money. It's not enough money for us to even think about what's the value of the reparations for the social injustice just to African Americans, much less everybody else up there. But what it is a missional investment. What it is the acknowledgement that sometimes organizations get into bad habits when they're trying to resolve big problems. So I wanted to give you some framing around why is that there. And the good news is a lot of that money is currently in that larger budget. And the expectation is it will be continued. But you notice we didn't use the word national plans. That's because we don't know what General Conference will do in the future, and we're not going to bind them to a ministry that they do now that they may or may not want to continue. But it needs to be focused on these people. Does that make sense?
Concern for centrists in the church, and how does this
is Junius Dotson, who's the
concern?
Board of
Well, I
Discipleship
would
Chair.
lift up to you 3 things that I think are very, very important for centrists in the church. Number 1, room. Room, space for United Methodist churches and for United Methodist pastors to have different perspectives, to have different perspectives on the question, particularly of same-sex marriage, and that it's okay that we have and share different perspectives. But we are unified around something. We are unified around our desire to be a church that welcomes all persons and a church that's creating safe spaces. So that, I think we're unified in that regard. The second thing I think is important for centrists is the removal of the language and policies that discriminate and treat LGBTQ persons as second-class Christians. And I think that's something that's very, very important to centrists across our denomination. And lastly, I think what's important for centrists for the United Methodist Church to continue. We believe in this church, and we wanted this church to continue, and really felt that as we considered all of the legislation that's coming before General Conference, all of the different plans that's coming before General Conference, a lot of them basically were moving towards dissolution, dissolving the church. And we felt that this would have, as we were reminded by our Central Conference conversation partners, that this would have catastrophic effects on an impact on our ministries in ways that we could not measure or fully calculate. So it was important that there was a path for the United Methodist Church to continue and for persons to not be required to vote to remain United Methodist. There's freedom of vote, but there's no requirement to remain United Methodist. And that's a very, very important piece, I think, for centrists.
Concern for centrists.
There's one other interview here, and I'm curious if it's going to pop. Oh, no, it didn't. Okay. The other thing the protocol calls for is a moratorium, and this is sort of what do we do now to General Conference, because we're under this traditional plan. And if pastors choose to do same-sex marriages, it's going to be very punitive if they did that from January 1st of this year. And so the protocol, all these groups, the traditional folks over here, all said, you know what? It would probably be best, if we want to get to General Conference and resolve this, it would be best if the plan that we passed, if people would put in abeyance. They didn't say this alone, we all said it, but they agreed as everybody else agreed. And said, why don't we, abeyance is a word in the book of discipline, and it sort of means if there's a complaint about a pastor who's done a same-sex marriage, it gets put in a file, and you just put that on the edge of your desk. Do you have any files like that on your desk? Where you're holding things in abeyance? My wife has a whole list of things that I've been holding in abeyance for some time. It just means I'm not going to act on this. So we've asked all the bishops to do this. This is an optional deal. Every bishop has that right. They are the bishops, and they've been duly elected, and they can do what they want. But what the protocol attempted to do is to create a space. See, when you enter into mediation, you've got to enter into a space, and it's a space of peacemaking. And one of the first things, I'll never forget, I was on this phone call, and it was a conference call with a group of us that were, it wasn't the whole group, and I was responding to something. Ken Feinberg does what he calls shuttle diplomacy, and he goes from one group, and then he tells the other group, and then he tells the other group, and he keeps working you back and forth, and he's this neutral party in the middle, and so he shared what somebody had said, and I just spouted off, and I had like 4 things that I was just like, well, let me tell you about that, and here's what I think, and I was just sort of, I was not in my good space. And he said, and he just listened, and then finally went, you know, Tom, thank you for sharing that. I just want to tell you that I disagree with you on everything you just said. And here's why. Here's why. Here's the opportunity that you have at this time. Here's what you could do. Think about this. And he just brought me into a space that was so much more creative than my anger. So what we invited the bishops to do is to enter into a space. They can choose to. They may not choose to. I don't know what they're going to do. It is what it is.
We all learned a little child play, hand play, when we began our Sunday school classes. You know, here's the church, here's the steeple. Open the doors and see the people. So we've talked a lot. You've heard that this is a commitment to the church about the kind of church and the gospel that we carry. I want to speak a little bit about the people. Because really, what this does, thank you, what this does is it changes the landscape for people who have been deeply harmed. Sorry about the tears. I speak to my LGBT friends out there. This protocol ends the harm. It just does.
David is an openly gay, ordained United Methodist pastor who is married. So, you know, it's one thing for me to talk about the issues of the protocol. David's talking about his life. And as a straight person, I just want to say, to the best of my ability, I get there's a big difference in those two things. And so what the abeyance tried to do was to give people room just to not experience that pain. So there's a question that the press is asking, are the Methodists in a divorce? And what I've said is maybe it's a reconciliation. The Pittsburgh paper says the Methodists, the mediator in the divorce plan. That's a catchy headline, isn't it? LA Times, can this church be saved? Split on LGBTQ issues, United Methodists considered divorce. I was talking to somebody with NPR, and I couldn't figure out what I was trying to say during the interview, and so I wrote her an email as soon as it was done. In fact, I was at a delegation meeting. I left a chapel service, which you really shouldn't do. But I thought, you know, I think the Lord will give me a break on this one. And I went and wrote on my computer, and I said, I know you framed this as a divorce. I want you to consider that maybe it's a reconciliation. Because when a group of people that have been at war with each other sit in a room with a very reasonable mediator, and they begin to think not about what they have to have, but what would help the other person. And when they do that with a generous heart, and when they do that in an attempt to help everybody walk out of the room saying, I got what I need and it feels fair. In the life of the church, that's reconciliation. And it does include this separation, but that $39 million I told you about, traditionalists can apply for that because that was a part of the settlement they put into the pot. So we're going to have some connectivity. And you know what else we know? We separated in 1844 over the issue of slavery. And many, many decades later, we came back together. So we don't know where the future's headed. So I think this is more reconciliation than it is divorce. But General Conference delegates will have to decide that. But I can tell you this, what we're doing right now is not healthy, and I won't be doing any more of it. Once this is all done. Because if the system is so dysfunctional, and let me give you a little secret, there are some conflict junkies out there. And you're not healthy if all you want is the conflict. So this is a really important time to see if General Conference delegates want to enter into this space that's been created by this process. Now, how does all this get done? Well, section 6 on page 6 of the protocol describes how all this gets done. And let me just tell you, that section is wrong. It was written quickly, and it was written in a very hopeful and buoyant moment. And I was there, so I know it. So it's not going to work. So if you have read that and you're saying, Tom, it's not going to work, you're right. I want to validate that. So what people are doing now is trying to figure out how do we do everything that we want to get done, because the broad center that wants to remain the United Methodist Church, you know what it wants? It wants everything in 2020. It wants the whole package. It wants to get rid of the language. It wants to get what we call a regional conference. It wants the provisions of the protocol. It wants to give people the ability to separate. It wants everything in 2020. And the problem is it's very hard to do all that given the system that we're in. Just as many of you work for the federal government and you write legislation that affects the federal government, and you know how hard it is to do something, because as one organizational expert said to me, the United Methodist Church is like all large organizations. It is a big, wet hairball that you are trying to untwine. And when you pull one section, it breaks in another. And that's what writing the legislation is like. But we're going to figure that out, and it's going to require a high level of coordination and cooperation amongst everybody. All those delegates, 864 of them, I think, they're going to have to be in a cooperative space, and that'll be a new set of muscles for them to use. What's next is we're drafting legislation by this mediation team. We're going to find a way to get that legislation to General Conference, and there are 3 ways to do it, and a 4th one that's not up there, but the 3 ways are these. The annual conference passes the legislation without any changes. So is there an annual conference somewhere that in a regular session in a central conference or in a called session in the U.S. would vote all the legislation through and not amend it? Because once you start amending it, you're not in the protocol anymore. So is there a conference? I don't know. I hope there is. Some are going to try. Second, we could at General Conference just stand up and say, Terry could come up, because you know Terry, she'll do anything. Right? Terry comes up, she says, I'd like a motion to suspend the rules. And if that passes, then you can put it in front of the delegates and be properly before them. Third, there could be a motion to substitute. Yes, this is the Next Generation UMC plan. We have a motion to substitute all of this in place of that plan. That's another way to do it. The first way is the best way because it allows the communication to get out faster. So I hope that'll happen, but I don't know if it'll happen.